The thermometer outside read -35°C, a number so cold it stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like a threat. Yet inside the small underground shelter, the air hovered at a steady 22 degrees, warm enough to sit in shirt sleeves, warm enough to sleep without piling on every blanket you owned. And outside in the subdivision, just 200 meters away, neighbors huddled under layers in darkened houses where the power had failed and the cold was seeping through. Walls and floors like water through cracked stone. And this wasn't luck. This wasn't some miracle of nature. This was the result of months of planning, hard decisions, a few mistakes along the way, and a willingness to dig into the earth instead of building on top of it. And if you've ever wondered how someone could stay comfortable when the rest of the world is freezing, stay with me, because this story is about survival, physics, and the lessons learned when winter stops being a season and becomes an adversary. And before we go any further, if you want to see more real-world survival stories, engineering solutions, and the kind of practical knowledge that might save your life one day, hit that subscribe button now, because we're diving deep into what actually works when the stakes are life and death. 6 months before that record-breaking cold snap, the man who would build this shelter, a 43-year-old carpenter named Daniel, stood in his backyard, looking at a gentle slope that ran down toward a stand of spruce trees, and he was thinking about heat, about how every winter his power bill climbed, how the drafts in his old farmhouse made the furnace run constantly, how the wind off the open fields would knife through the siding no matter how much caulking he applied, and he had been reading, researching, sketching ideas on graph paper late at night, and the idea that kept coming back was simple and ancient. Go down instead of up. Use the earth itself as insulation. Build a space where the temperature of the ground, stable at around 4 to 8 degrees Celsius year-round at depth, would be the starting point, instead of fighting the ambient air temperature. And he knew this wasn't a new concept. People had built earth shelters, root cellars, dugouts for centuries. But he wanted something he could live in comfortably if the power went out for days or weeks. A true backup, a refuge. And so he started digging. The site he chose was partway down the slope, good drainage, high enough that groundwater wouldn't be an issue, and he marked out a rectangle roughly 4 meters by 5 meters, not huge, but large enough for a bed, a small stove, storage, a workspace, and he rented a small excavator for a weekend and carved into the hillside, sloping the floor slightly toward the entrance for any water that might seep in, and he dug down about 2 meters, then carved back into the hill another 3 meters, creating a space that was partially buried on 3 sides and fully covered on top. And the spoil from the excavation he piled to the sides, planning to use it later for berming and additional earth cover. And the first thing he learned was that dirt is heavy. Dirt shifts, and if you don't stabilize it, it will try to reclaim your space. And so he framed the walls with pressure-treated timber, 6 by 6 posts at the corners and along the back wall, horizontal planks to hold the earth back, and across the top he laid a series of engineered lumber beams, strong enough to carry the weight of soil and snow, spacing them every 60 centimeters, and on top of those beams he put down a layer of thick plywood, then a waterproof membrane, heavy-duty pond liner material, overlapping the seams and sealing them with adhesive, because the one thing that will destroy an earth shelter faster than anything is water infiltration. And once the membrane was down, he added a drainage layer, coarse, gravel, so any moisture that did get through would channel away instead of pooling. And then he began adding the earth back on top, at first just 30 centimeters, then over the following weeks he built it up to nearly a meter of soil, which provided thermal mass, insulation and protection. And he planted low grasses on top, their roots helping to stabilize the soil and prevent erosion. The entrance was the tricky part, because every time you open a door to the outside you lose heat, and cold air sinks, so he built a small vestibule, essentially an airlock, a box frame extending 1.5 meters out from the main entrance, with its own door so you would step into the vestibule, close the outer door, then open the inner door, minimizing the cold air that rushed in. And he insulated the vestibule as well, rigid foam panels on the inside of the framing, and both doors were solid core with weather stripping, and he angled the entrance slightly downward so cold air would have to fight gravity to get in. A small detail, but every bit helped. and around the entrance he built up a berm of earth, a crescent shape that blocked the prevailing northwest wind. And he planted dense shrubs there, another windbreak because even though the shelter was underground, the entrance was still exposed, and wind chill could make that transition brutal. Inside, the walls were lined with rigid foam insulation, 10-centimeter panels of extruded polystyrene, the kind with an R value of about 5 per inch, so he was getting R25 on the walls, and he sealed every seam with expanding foam and tape, making the space as airtight as he could because air leaks are heat leaks, and cold air finding a way in will undo all the other work. And the floor he covered with a layer of foam as well, then plywood, then a simple vinyl floor for ease of cleaning, and the ceiling under those beams got another layer of foam between the joists and a plywood interior finish. And when he was done, the whole interior was a continuous insulated envelope, and it felt tight, almost claustrophobic at first, but that tightness was the point, because every gap, every crack is a place where heat escapes and cold infiltrates. He installed a small wood stove, a compact model designed for tiny homes with a 5-inch flue pipe, and he ran that pipe up through the ceiling, through the earth cover, extending it high enough above the surface to ensure good draft and keep snow from blocking it. And around the penetration he was meticulous fire-resistant shielding, a metal collar, clearances from any wood framing, because a stove in an enclosed space is a lifeline but also a hazard, and he installed a carbon monoxide detector and a smoke detector, both battery-powered with backups, and he kept a fire extinguisher mounted near the entrance, and he practiced lighting the stove, learning how much kindling it needed, how to adjust the damper for a clean burn, how to avoid smoldering, smoky fires that would fill the space with creosote and eat up oxygen, and he learned that small fires, fed steadily, were far more efficient than big, roaring fires, because a big fire would overheat the space, make it uncomfortable, force him to open a vent and waste heat, whereas a small, steady fire kept the temperature stable and used less wood, and he stockpiled dry firewood, splitting it fine, storing it in a covered area outside the entrance, rotating it so the driest pieces were always ready. Because wet wood doesn't just burn poorly, it creates steam, creosote, and reduces the stove's efficiency dramatically. Ventilation was the part that made him most nervous, because a sealed, insulated space can suffocate you if you're not careful, and burning wood consumes oxygen and produces carbon dioxide, and if the flue isn't drafting properly you can get backdraft, carbon monoxide, death. And so he installed a small passive air intake, a 4-inch PVC pipe that ran from the outside, down through the earth, and terminated low on the back wall of the shelter. And the idea was that as the stove drew air up, the flue fresh air would be pulled in through that intake, a natural convection loop, and he screened the intake outside to keep insects and debris out, and he angled it downward slightly so rain wouldn't run in, and he put a simple damper on the inside so he could throttle it if needed. And the first time he tested the system, he lit a small fire and watched the smoke, and it took a few minutes for the flue to warm up and establish draft. But once it did, the smoke rose cleanly, and he could feel the cool air coming in through the intake, and he realized he needed to position that intake carefully, because if it blew directly on him, it would be uncomfortable, and so he routed it behind a thermal mass, a barrel of water, so the incoming air would pass by the warm barrel and temper slightly before mixing into the room. And this was a lesson learned through discomfort, sitting there in the early tests, feeling a draft on his neck and adjusting until the airflow was smooth and unobtrusive. He added thermal mass deliberately, because thermal mass is what keeps an underground shelter stable. The earth itself is thermal mass, millions of kilograms of dirt and rock that resist temperature changes, but inside the space he wanted more, and so he brought in 6 50-gallon barrels, filled them with water, positioned them along the back wall and near the stove, painted them black to absorb radiant heat, and those barrels became heat batteries during the day when the stove was burning. They would warm up, and at night or when the fire died down they would release that heat slowly, and the same principle applied to the stone he brought in. Flat river stones he mortared into a low bench near the stove, and a section of brick he salvaged from an old chimney and stacked as a heat shield behind the stove. All of that mass soaking up heat and radiating it back over hours, and he also left the earthen walls exposed in places because the dirt itself, once warmed, holds that warmth. And the combination of water, stone, brick and earth created a thermal inertia that meant the temperature inside didn't swing wildly. It rose slowly when he burned the stove, and it fell slowly when he didn't, and that stability was the key to comfort. He made mistakes, small ones, things he had to fix. The first version of his door seal wasn't tight enough. He could feel air moving around the edges on windy days, and so he added more weather stripping, a second layer, and he adjusted the door so it pressed firmly into the frame, and he learned that the vestibule door needed the same attention, because even a small gap there would let cold air into the vestibule. And then the next time he opened the inner door, that cold air would spill in, and he realized that moisture was an issue, because he was breathing, cooking, burning wood, all of which produced water vapor, and in a tight space that vapor had nowhere to go, and it would condense on the coldest surfaces, which in his case were the door and the section of wall near the entrance, and he started seeing frost forming there on really cold nights, and he knew that frost meant he was losing heat and creating a feedback loop, because frost insulates poorly and wicks warmth away, and so he added a small dehumidifier, battery-powered, and he made a habit of wiping down condensation before it could freeze, and he adjusted his ventilation, opening the intake damper a bit more to let moist air escape and dry air come in, and it was a balancing act. Too much ventilation and he lost heat, too little and he got condensation and stale air, and he learned to read the signs, the smell of the air, the feel of it on his skin, the behavior of the stove flame. He installed a small 12-volt LED lighting system, powered by a deep-cycle battery, that he charged with a solar panel outside, and he kept a backup battery and a hand-crank flashlight, and he set up a simple shelf system for food storage, dry goods, canned goods, water in containers, and he kept a notebook where he tracked temperatures, wood usage, observations, problems, solutions, and he spent nights down there testing the system, sometimes in autumn when it was only a few degrees below, freezing. And he would wake up in the morning and check the thermometer and see that the temperature had barely moved, maybe dropped 2 degrees overnight, and he knew he was onto something. But he also knew that a test in -5 was different from a test in -35, and he wondered if the real test would come, and if he would be ready. The forecast came in late November, a cold front dropping out of the Arctic, high pressure stalling over the region, clear skies, no wind at first, just brutal radiational cooling, and the meteorologists were calling for temperatures to drop to -30, possibly -35 for 3 to 5 days. And this was the kind of cold that made the news, the kind that killed livestock, froze plumbing, stranded motorists, and Daniel looked at his shelter and decided this was the test, and he told his wife, who lived with him in the main farmhouse, that he was going to spend the cold snap in the shelter, see how it performed, and she thought he was crazy but also understood. He had put months of work into this, and if it failed he needed to know why, and if it worked he wanted to document it, and so he stocked the shelter with a week's worth of food, extra batteries, a full wood rack, water, blankets, his notebook, a camera, and he prepared to go underground while the world above froze. The first night the temperature dropped to -28, and he lit the stove in the late afternoon. A small fire, feeding it dry spruce splits, and the shelter warmed quickly, the thermometer inside climbing from 15 degrees, which was the temperature the earth had buffered it to, up to 20 degrees within an hour, and he kept the fire small, just enough to bring it to 22 and hold it there. And he closed the intake damper halfway, balancing fresh air against heat loss, and he could hear the wind starting outside, a low moan that grew into a howl as the night came on, and he stepped into the vestibule and then briefly outside to check the flue, and the cold hit him like a physical force, the air so frigid it hurt to breathe, and he could see his breath crystallizing, falling like tiny snow, and the stars were unnaturally bright, the sky vast and merciless, and he ducked back inside, sealed both doors, and the wind noise faded to a distant rumble, muffled by earth and insulation. And inside the shelter it was still warm, the stove ticking softly as the metal expanded, the light from the LED strips casting soft shadows, and he sat on his cot and wrote in his notebook, temperature holding steady at 22, stove burning clean. No condensation yet, air feels fresh, and he felt a strange sense of calm, almost like being in a ship, sealed away from the storm. In the neighborhood, in the houses built on the surface, the cold was a different experience. The wind found every seam, every gap, and even with furnaces running, people could feel drafts, cold spots. The floors were icy. And then around midnight the power went out. A transformer failed, overloaded by the demand. And suddenly a dozen homes went dark and silent, and the furnaces stopped. And within an hour the indoor temperatures began to drop. People piled on blankets, moved everyone into one room, tried to use their gas stoves for heat, which was dangerous, and some of them started their cars in the garage to run heaters, which was more dangerous. And by morning the indoor temperatures in those homes were down to 5-8 degrees. Pipes were starting to freeze and people were scared, calling for emergency services, asking for warming centers, and the cold was unrelenting. The sun rose but gave no warmth. The air stayed locked at -32. Daniel woke in the shelter after a solid sleep. The temperature inside was still 21 degrees. The stove had burned down to coals, and he added a few splits, opened the damper, and the fire caught again, and he heated water on the stove, made instant coffee, ate oatmeal, and he noted that the air still felt good. The CO detector was silent, and there was a slight shimmer of moisture on the door, but no frost yet, and he dressed warmly and stepped outside to check on his neighbors. And the cold was vicious. The wind had died, but the stillness was worse. The air felt solid, and he walked the 200 meters to the nearest house and knocked, and his neighbor, a man named Tom, opened the door, and the cold poured out, and Tom's face was haggard. He had been up all night trying to keep his family warm, and Daniel said, "Come down to my shelter, bring your kids, warm up." And Tom looked at him like he was speaking another language. "What shelter?" And Daniel explained. And they gathered, the family, 2 small children, and walked down the hill, and when they stepped into the vestibule and then into the main space, the warmth hit them, and the kids started crying, not from fear, but from relief. And Tom just stood there, staring at the stove, the barrels, the insulation, and he said, "How is this possible?" And Daniel said, "Earth, insulation, air tightness, small steady heat," and they stayed for 2 hours drinking hot tea, warming their hands, and Daniel gave them extra blankets and a propane heater he had as backup, and he told Tom to close off most of his house, live in one room, seal gaps with towels, run the heater only in that space. And Tom thanked him and they left, and Daniel went back to monitoring his shelter. The second night the temperature dropped further, -35, and the wind returned, gusting to 50 kilometers per hour, and the wind chill was deadly, -50 or worse, and Daniel could hear it above him, a roar and shriek, and he thought about the thin layer of earth and membrane between him and that wind. But the temperature inside barely moved. The thermal mass was doing its job, the insulation was holding, and he kept the stove fed, and he noticed the first sign of trouble. Around midnight, the flue wasn't drafting as well. The smoke wasn't rising as cleanly, and he opened the front door a crack to check, and he saw ice forming on the exterior of the flue cap. The moisture from the exhaust was freezing instantly in the brutal cold, and ice was building up, narrowing the opening, and he knew if that continued, the flue would block, smoke would back up, and he would have a serious problem. And so he bundled up, stepped outside into the screaming wind, and climbed onto the low berm above the shelter, and the cold was beyond anything he had felt. His face went numb in seconds, and he knocked the ice off the flue cap with a stick, cleared it, and climbed back down. And inside he adjusted the stove, burned it hotter for a few minutes to melt any ice inside the pipe, then throttled it back down, and he made a note. Check flue every 3 hours in extreme cold, and he set an alarm. The moisture issue got worse on the 3rd day, the coldest day, because the temperature differential between inside and outside was so extreme that even with ventilation, even with the dehumidifier, moisture was condensing, and he saw frost forming on the inside of the door and on the coldest section of wall near the entrance, and he knew this was a heat leak. The insulation there wasn't enough, and he grabbed a sleeping bag and hung it over that section of wall, adding another layer, and he wiped down the door, dried it, and he opened the intake vent more, letting in more cold air but also letting moist air escape up the flue, and it helped. The frost stopped growing, but he realized that if this went on for a week, he would need to improve that section, add more foam, maybe build an insulated panel, and he wrote it in his notebook. Weak point at entrance wall, needs another R10. He went out again on the 3rd evening to check on neighbors, and one family had left, gone to stay with relatives in town, but another family, an older couple, was still there, and their house was down to 0 degrees inside. The pipes had frozen, they were running a gas stove with the oven door open, and Daniel told them that was dangerous, carbon monoxide, and he convinced them to come to his shelter for the night, and they did. And they slept on the floor on foam mats, wrapped in blankets, and the old woman said she had lived through cold winters before, but nothing like this. And Daniel said, "This is what happens when you build on the surface. You're fighting the air temperature. But underground you start with the earth temperature, and that makes all the difference." And the old man asked, "How much did this cost you?" And Daniel said the excavator rental was $800, the lumber and insulation maybe $3,000, the stove another $600, so under $5,000 total. And the old man said that's less than a new furnace, and Daniel nodded. The fourth day the temperature finally started to climb, -30 in the morning, -25 by afternoon, and the wind dropped, and you could feel the tension breaking. People started venturing out, checking their houses, assessing damage, and the power came back on in sections. And Daniel stayed in the shelter, monitoring, and he noted that even as the outside temperature rose, the inside temperature was stable. It hadn't spiked. It was still 22, and that was the thermal mass at work, buffering the swings, and he let the fire die down, and over the next 6 hours the temperature inside dropped slowly, 22 to 20 to 18, and he knew that if he let it go, it would eventually settle at whatever the earth temperature was, probably around 6 or 8 degrees. But that slow decline meant he had hours of buffer, time to restart the fire if he needed to. He spent the 5th day cleaning up, restocking wood, inspecting the shelter, and he found a small crack in one of the foam panels where it had been stressed, and he sealed it with spray foam, and he adjusted the door again, tightened the hinges, and he checked the flue from top to bottom, cleaned out a small amount of creosote, and he sat down and wrote a long entry in his notebook, summarizing what worked and what didn't. And the list of what worked was long. Earth insulation, thermal mass, airtight construction, small efficient stove, controlled ventilation, vestibule entry, and the list of what needed improvement was shorter but important. Flue icing in extreme cold, moisture condensation near entry, need better door seal, need backup plan for flue access in deep snow. And he realized that this wasn't a finished project. It was an evolving one, and every extreme event would teach him something. When he emerged fully and walked back to his house, his wife met him at the door and said, "The neighbors are calling you the mole man." And he laughed. And she said seriously, though, "People are talking," Tom told everyone, "and now half the neighborhood wants to know how you did it." And Daniel said, "I'll show anyone who wants to learn." And over the next few weeks he had visitors. People came and looked at the shelter, asked questions, took notes, and some of them were skeptical. Said it looked like a lot of work, said they'd just buy a generator. And Daniel said a generator needs fuel, needs maintenance, and if the cold lasts a week, you'll run out of fuel, or the generator will fail. But the earth doesn't fail. The insulation doesn't run out. The thermal mass doesn't need refueling, and some people got it and some didn't. And that was fine. One of the things Daniel explained to anyone who asked was that the 22 degrees wasn't magic. It was physics. The Earth at 2 meters depth stays at a relatively constant temperature year-round, somewhere between 4 and 8 degrees depending on location, and if you insulate that space well enough, seal it tight enough, and add a small amount of heat, you're not trying to heat from -35 to 22. You're trying to heat from 6 or 8 to 22, and that's a difference of 14 to 16 degrees, not 47 degrees, and that's why a small stove, burning maybe 2 kilograms of wood over 6 hours, can maintain comfort, because you're not fighting the full outdoor temperature, you're working with the earth as your baseline, and the insulation keeps that heat from escaping, and the thermal mass smooths out the peaks and valleys, and the result is a stable, comfortable environment with minimal energy input. And he would show them the math, the tar values, the BTUs, the volume of the space and the heat loss calculations, and some people's eyes would glaze over, but others would nod. They understood, and a few of them started planning their own projects. He also talked about the safety aspects, because he didn't want anyone to build something dangerous, and he emphasized the carbon monoxide detector, the smoke detector, the importance of proper flue installation, maintaining clearances around the stove, never burning treated wood or trash, keeping the stove clean, inspecting the flue regularly, and he talked about ventilation, how you need fresh air, how you can't just seal yourself in, and he talked about structural safety, how you need proper shoring if you're digging into a hillside, how you need to think about drainage, how you need a waterproof barrier. And he said, if you don't know how to do this, hire someone, or at least consult with someone, because a collapse can kill you, water infiltration can ruin the space, and a poorly vented stove can poison you. And he was blunt about it, because he didn't want to read about someone dying because they tried to copy his shelter and cut corners. The lesson that Daniel kept coming back to, the one he told everyone, was that comfort in extreme conditions isn't about having the biggest furnace or the most expensive technology. It's about working with nature instead of against it, using the Earth's thermal stability, using insulation to hold heat, using mass to store heat, using small efficient heat sources instead of big wasteful ones. And he said the reason his neighbors froze while he stayed comfortable wasn't because he was smarter or richer. It was because he had prepared, he had thought through the failure points. He had tested the system, and he had built in redundancy. And when the power failed, when the cold came, his shelter didn't depend on the grid, didn't depend on a supply chain, didn't depend on anything except the ground under his feet and the wood he had split and stacked. And that self-reliance wasn't about paranoia or survivalism. It was about understanding that extreme weather is becoming more common, that infrastructure is fragile, and that taking responsibility for your own safety and comfort is a reasonable, rational thing to do. He thought about the old couple who had spent the night in his shelter and how the old woman had said she felt safe there, safer than she had felt in her own house. And he realized that safety isn't just about temperature. It's about knowing that the systems you depend on will work, and that you're not at the mercy of forces beyond your control, and the shelter gave him that. It was a space where the physics were predictable, where his preparation mattered, where his decisions had direct consequences, good and bad, and he could learn and adapt, and that sense of agency, of competence, was worth more than the $5,000 he had spent. It was worth more than the 100 hours of labor, because it meant that when the next cold snap came, and there would be another one, he wouldn't be huddled in a dark house wondering if the pipes would burst. He would be underground, warm, comfortable, reading a book by LED light, feeding a small fire, and sleeping soundly. The shelter also became a community resource. Daniel made it clear that if anyone needed to warm up, if anyone had an emergency, they could come down. And during the next winter, which was milder, a neighbor's furnace did fail on a cold night, and they brought their family down at 2 in the morning, and Daniel made hot chocolate, and the kids thought it was an adventure, and the parents were grateful, and in the spring that neighbor helped Daniel improve the entrance insulation. They worked together, adding another layer of foam, building a better seal. And that reciprocity, that sense of mutual aid, was part of what made the shelter valuable. It wasn't just a personal refuge, it was a node of resilience in a fragile system. Daniel also documented everything. He took photos, he wrote detailed notes. He created a simple guide that he shared online, and he was careful to include the mistakes, the things that didn't work the first time, because he wanted people to learn from his experience, not repeat his errors. And he got emails from people in Canada, in Scandinavia, in Russia, places where extreme cold was a regular occurrence, and they shared their own designs, their own solutions, and he learned from them, and he updated his own shelter. He added a small hydronic heating loop, a coil of pipe that ran through the thermal mass barrels and connected to the stove, so the heat from the stove would warm the water, and the water would circulate by convection and distribute heat more evenly, and it worked. It made the shelter even more comfortable. And he shared that modification, and the knowledge spread. And he felt like he was part of a community of people who were thinking seriously about resilience, about sustainability, about how to live well in a world where the climate was becoming less predictable. One of the questions people asked him most often was whether the shelter felt claustrophobic. And he said honestly, at first, yes, it did. The low ceiling, the small space, the lack of windows, it felt confining, but he got used to it, and he realized that comfort isn't just about square footage, it's about control, about stability, about knowing that the space is doing what it's supposed to do. And after a few nights in the shelter, he stopped noticing the size. He noticed the warmth, The quiet, the way the stove light flickered on the walls, the smell of wood smoke and earth, and he found it peaceful, meditative even, and he started spending more time there, not just in emergencies, but by choice, reading, thinking, working on projects. And his wife would come down sometimes and they would have dinner there, soup heated on the stove, bread, cheese. And she admitted it had a certain charm, a coziness that their big drafty farmhouse didn't have. The other question people asked was about cost, and he was always honest. He said, if you're starting from scratch, if you're paying someone to excavate, to build, to install, you could easily spend 20 or 30,000. But if you do the work yourself, if you scrounge materials, if you keep it simple, you can do it for under 5,000. And he said the real cost is time. It took him 3 months of weekends and evenings, and you have to be willing to learn, to make mistakes, to iterate. And not everyone is willing to do that, and that's fine. But for those who are, the payoff is enormous, not just in terms of energy savings, though those are real. His winter heating costs dropped by more than half. But in terms of peace of mind, knowing that you have a space that will work when everything else fails. He thought about that night when the temperature was -35, when the wind was howling, when his neighbors were cold and scared, and he was sitting in his shelter in a t-shirt, warm, comfortable, safe. And he thought about how strange it was that this simple hole in the ground, this insulated box, could make such a difference. And he realized that most people don't think about heat. Not really. They think about furnaces and thermostats and utility bills, but they don't think about where heat comes from, where it goes, how it moves. And if you understand those things, if you understand that heat flows from warm to cold, that insulation slows that flow, that mass stores heat, that convection moves air, if you understand those basic principles, then you can design a space that works with those principles instead of fighting them. And that's what the shelter was. It was applied physics, it was thermodynamics made tangible, and it worked. He also thought about the larger implications, about how if more people built spaces like this, even just as backups, as emergency refugees, the strain on the grid during extreme weather would be less, the number of emergency calls would drop, the risk of deaths from exposure would decrease. And he wasn't naive. He knew that not everyone could dig a hole in their backyard, not everyone had land, not everyone had the skills or the time. But he thought that even in urban settings, even in apartments, the principles could be applied: better insulation, thermal mass, airtight construction, efficient heating. And he thought that the real problem was that most buildings were designed for average conditions, not extreme conditions. And when the extremes came, and they were coming more often, those buildings failed and people suffered. And he thought that needed to change, that building codes needed to change, that expectations needed to change. And maybe his shelter and the conversations it started could be a small part of that change. The winter after the big freeze was milder. The coldest it got was -15, and Daniel spent a few nights in the shelter just to keep testing, and he found that at -15 he barely needed to run the stove. Just a small fire in the evening to bring the temperature up from the earth baseline of 6 degrees to a comfortable 18 or 20, and then he could let it coast overnight on thermal mass. And he realized that the shelter was actually over-designed for moderate cold, which was fine. Because when you're designing for survival, you want headroom, you want to know that your system can handle the worst case. And if the worst case is -40 and your shelter can maintain comfort at -35, then you have a margin of safety, and that margin is what lets you sleep at night. He made one more major modification that second winter. He added a small root cellar section, an extension off the back of the main space, even deeper, where the temperature would stay just above freezing year-round, perfect for storing root vegetables, apples, canned goods. And he insulated that section less because he didn't want it warm. He wanted it cold, but not frozen, and it worked beautifully. He could store a winter's worth of food down there, and it didn't require any energy, no refrigerator, no freezer, just the stable cold of the earth. And his wife started canning more, making preserves, pickling vegetables, and they found that having that storage changed the way they thought about food. They were less dependent on weekly grocery runs. They could buy in bulk, preserve the harvest, and ride out not just cold snaps, but supply chain disruptions, price spikes, any number of uncertainties. The thing that surprised Daniel the most, looking back, was how much he enjoyed the process, the building, the problem-solving, the testing, the small victories when something worked, and even the setbacks when something didn't, because each setback taught him something, and he realized that this project had reconnected him with a kind of practical knowledge that he had been missing, working with his hands, working with the land, understanding materials and forces and systems. And it was satisfying in a way that his regular carpentry work, building decks and renovating kitchens, wasn't, because this was for him, for his family, for his survival. And the stakes were real, and the feedback was immediate, and he thought that maybe more people needed projects like this, not necessarily earth shelters, but something, some way to take direct responsibility for their own well-being, to build resilience, to stop outsourcing everything to systems they didn't understand and couldn't control. The numbers told the story. During that 5-day cold snap, when the outside temperature averaged -32 and dipped to -35, the shelter maintained an inside temperature of 20 to 22 degrees, with an average wood consumption of about 3 kilograms per day, less than one small fire every 6 hours, and the total cost of heating for those 5 days was essentially zero, since he had cut the wood himself from deadfall on his property, and meanwhile his neighbors, who stayed in their homes, even those who got their power back, were burning through propane, running electric heaters, spending hundreds of dollars to keep 1 or 2 rooms barely comfortable, and in the homes that lost power entirely. The cost was measured not in money but in suffering, frozen pipes, spoiled food, sleepless nights, stress, fear, and in one case, a family that had to be evacuated because their house dropped below freezing and they had an infant. And when Daniel heard that story, he thought about how unnecessary it was, how a few $1,000s and a few months of work could have prevented that, and he felt a mix of frustration and sadness because the knowledge was out there, the techniques were proven, but people didn't know, or didn't believe, or didn't have the resources, and he wondered what it would take to change that. He started giving talks, small groups, community centers, online forums, and he always started with that story. The story of the cold snap, the story of 22 degrees inside when it was -35 outside, and he walked people through the principles: Earth's insulation, thermal mass, air tightness, efficient heat, and he showed photos, diagrams, budget breakdowns, and he answered questions. And the most common question was always, would this work where I live? And the answer was almost always yes, with modifications, because the principles are universal. Heat flows from warm to cold, insulation slows that flow, mass stores heat, and whether you're in Canada or Minnesota or northern China or Siberia, those principles apply. The specifics change, the depth you need to dig, the amount of insulation, the type of heating, but the core idea is the same. Use the earth, insulate well, heat efficiently, and you can stay comfortable in extreme cold without depending on fragile infrastructure. Some people pushed back. They said this is too much work, too unconventional, too weird. And Daniel didn't argue. He said, you're right, it's not for everyone, but when the power goes out and it's -30 and your kids are cold, you might wish you had put in the work, and that usually ended the conversation. Because people didn't like thinking about that scenario. It was uncomfortable, it was scary, and it was easier to assume it wouldn't happen to them. And Daniel understood that. He had been the same way once, but the cold snap had changed him. It had made the risks real, and he couldn't unknow what he knew now, which was that the systems most people depended on were more fragile than they believed, and that self-reliance wasn't paranoia, it was prudence. He also talked about climate change, carefully because it was a polarizing topic. But he said, look, whatever you believe about the cause, the data is clear. Extreme weather events are increasing in frequency and intensity. We're seeing colder cold snaps, hotter heat waves, more intense storms, more droughts, more floods, and that means the infrastructure that was designed for the climate of 50 years ago is increasingly inadequate, and rather than waiting for governments or utilities to adapt, which will take decades, individuals can adapt now, and an earth shelter is one way to do that. It's a way to create a microclimate, a controlled environment that isn't at the mercy of the external chaos, and whether the chaos is a polar vortex or a heat dome or a grid failure or a supply chain collapse. The shelter works because it's based on principles that don't change, and it's powered by resources that are local and renewable: wood, earth, sun, and those resources don't depend on global markets or political stability, or any of the things that make modern life so precarious. The final thing Daniel wanted people to understand, the thing he emphasized in every talk, every conversation, was that the 22 degrees wasn't the point. The point was agency. The point was knowing that you could take care of yourself and your family, that you weren't helpless, that you had options. And the shelter was just one option, one tool, and there were others. Better insulation in your existing home, a wood stove, a good sleeping bag, a plan, supplies, knowledge, and all of those. Things together created resilience, and resilience wasn't about being a survivalist or a prepper or a hermit. It was about being a responsible adult in an uncertain world. And he thought that was something everyone could get behind, regardless of politics or background or beliefs. Because when it's -35 and the power is out, none of that matters. What matters is whether you're warm or cold, safe or in danger. And if you've prepared, you're warm and safe. And if you haven't, you're not. And that's as simple and as serious as it gets. Now, if you found this story valuable, if you learned something, if it made you think about your own preparedness, your own resilience, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video. Leave a comment with your own experiences or questions, because this conversation is important. And the more people who are thinking about these things, the more people who are building their own solutions, the stronger and safer our communities will be. And if you want to see more content like this, real stories, practical solutions, honest assessments of what works and what doesn't, then your support makes that possible. So hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's keep learning together, because the next cold snap, the next heat wave, the next crisis is coming, and the time to prepare is now, not when the power is out and the temperature is plummeting, but today, when you have time, resources, and options. So take that first step, do the research, make a plan, start building. And when the test comes, and it will come, you'll be ready, you'll be warm, you'll be safe, and you'll know that the work you put in mattered, and that's a feeling worth more than anything money can buy.